Hello, Environmental Policy 2 students. It's Dr. Conway back to you for week 4, which is part of the course theme on risk management tools and business operations. Today we're talking about environmental management systems in business. I think you've all heard by now what an environmental management system or an EMS is. And it's to summarize it, it's a way of implementing a program of continual improvement within a business organization. And that became increasingly important as things have changed over time. I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit in a minute. And it's important for students to understand that the EMS is not intended to be a separate system within government, but rather or within business, but rather is an integrated system, fully integrated into the business management tools that are already practiced within a business, whatever those operational management practices are. The EMS intends to link itself or integrate itself into those management systems to foster environmental improvement along with other areas of improvement within the organization. But where did EMSs come from? I mean, EMSs were evolved over time as the limits to traditional command and control regulation became more apparent to everybody. Governments encountered limited resources. Those resources became tighter over time. Limited control over economic actors. All governments have limited control over economic actors. And imperfect knowledge about what was going on within the businesses that they were supposed to be regulating, and they were regulating more or less effectively. Under those conditions, what we saw was a need to provide a way for businesses to organize themselves better around environmental issues over time. And that was done through this concept of the environmental management system. As I mentioned to you once before, no government environmental regulator can be everywhere all the time. All forms of environmental legislation and environmental regulation assume that both parties, both the government and business, will assume substantial obligations to comply with the environmental norms of our society. That can be done through a regulatory means to an extent, but at a certain point, one just needs to realize that there's no way the government can be everywhere and everything to everybody. So shared responsibility for environmental protection is a key theme in all environmental policies. And environmental management systems became particularly important, and that issue of the responsibility of the private sector to improve their environmental performance became particularly important when environmental issues themselves became much more plentiful and more diffuse. We went from command and control of large point source pollutants like a chemical plant or a coal burning plant or something like that to environmental issues in the modern period, which are much more diffuse. That can be everything from disposing of hazardous waste from the household to any number of other areas where we see a complete diffusion of the environmental source. For example, climate change is a classic example of that. Everybody contributes to the greenhouse gas problem. How do you regulate all of these different actors and the way they perform? Now, returning just to the issue of businesses, however, I mean, that was also true with businesses. I mean, there's no way the government could be everywhere to control all things related to the environment. So the emphasis became improving the capacity of businesses to manage environmental management issues on their own, in their own operational procedures. And that became the basis for developing an EMS system. There's no way we could move forward with business in a lot of smaller areas without that. And people will often challenge the environmental management systems as being voluntary and not very effective and so on and so forth. And there's some truth to that. Sometimes environmental management systems can be used as greenwash. They can be used as purely surface show. But in most regulated communities in a country like Canada now, and for that matter in many countries, even in developing countries, most businesses, substantial businesses, will accept environmental norms as being something that they must comply with. And if they develop an environmental management system, they'll do it with an intent of actually trying to improve their environmental performance. And And that's a positive outcome of environmental management systems. Does it cover off everybody? Does it do it as rigorously as some might like? No, it probably doesn't, but it's better than not having any momentum for environmental management systems within business. Another trend that impacted the development of environmental management systems was the move from end-of-pipe type environmental issues to pollution prevention. I think it became broadly recognized in the global environmental policy community at the government level, but also in private sector, that mitigating was always way more expensive than prevention. And that's something that the business can listen to. That's something that business wants to hear. How can I comply with these societal norms in the least cost way? And prevention became a big issue. And so a lot of what business buys onto with environmental management systems is the reduction of risk through proper preparation and proper procedures to prevent accidents or prevent pollution from happening. And that's what environmental management systems try to do. They try to foster a pollution prevention mentality over a mitigation mentality. And the other thing that EMSs did was began to harness economic powers of the economy, the market powers of the economy, in that sense that those that had ISO 14000, let's say, would often broadcast that quite widely to their clientele, to the consumers, because it became a competitive advantage. Given the opportunity, most people will buy green, if given the cost spread not being too much between green companies and those that maybe are not promoting that theme or not advancing fast enough in the area of environmental management. So public relations was a very big issue. So was international trade, because a lot of countries now, for example, the EU, discourages importing products from suppliers that are not ISO 14000 or EMAS registered companies. And that became, so international trade actually became a big motivator for environmental management systems as well. And those market forces, whether those be public brand or international trade, became important issues. Plus, in a lot of cases in governments that do a lot of procurement to the tune of billions of dollars a year, they want, if you're supplying products now, the governments typically want you to be ISO 14000 certified, or have an equivalent or even stronger environmental management system from another program or another system that is in place. So governments have spent a fair bit of time supporting these adoption of these voluntary measures, because they recognize that reaching out to business in this way is the only practical option, given the limited resources and time and resources of all kind of actually going through a traditional command and control approach to environmental business practices. Now, there are two major environmental management systems. There are more than that, but the two major ones globally are, of course, ISO 14000 series and the Eco Management and Audit Scheme, EMAS, of the European Union. Those two systems tend to dominate most of the global community on environmental management systems. Now, there are some important distinctions between ISO 14000 and EMAS, and one of those is that in ISO 14000 does not require a business to state a clear environmental objective in terms of emission reductions or real reductions in any other major pollution problems that they're experiencing. EMAS, on the other hand, does. And EMAS also requires public reporting of emissions and things like that, and ISO 14000 does not. So EMAS, in many ways, is a much stronger system than ISO 14000, but ISO 14000 still has considerable strengths. Now, typically, what all environmental management systems require is that a organization, a business, establish an environmental policy for itself, appropriate to itself. And that environmental policy is measured against, the EMS performance is measured against that business policy, environmental policy, and that means that there's in ISO 14000, you're assessed against your own policy. In EMAS, it goes a bit further, requiring that that there be specific mention of other emission reduction standards, our emission reduction goals, and so on, that ISO 14000 does not require. And the next stage of an EMS is to identify the environmental aspects arising from the organization's past existence and its present operations. And that has to be clearly spelled out in an EMS, and a plan for managing those has to be in place. Now, both ISO 14000 and EMS require that the company identify the legislative and regulatory requirements that apply to that company, and that they show that they're in compliance. That they identify priorities and set appropriate environmental objectives and targets common to all EMSs. Establish a structure and programs to implement the policy and achieve objectives and targets. That has to be clearly in your EMS plan. Facilitate planning, control, monitoring, corrective action. All of those things that would go into operations through the life cycle of a company need to be demonstrated in the EMS, and that the EMS be adaptable to changing circumstances. Now, one can look at both ISO 14000 and EMS and see lots of commonalities between them. Okay, but as I was just saying, there are some significant differences as well. For example, EMS requires a public environmental statement. Okay, and that does not require it in ISO 14000. EMS requires summary of environmental performance data like pollutant emissions, as I was just saying. That is not required in ISO 14000. When there's an audit of an EMS, because all EMSs need to be audited, whether that be ISO 14000 or EMS, a goal of the audit is to determine compliance with EMS as well as efficacy of EMS in bringing about environmental progress at the site. That's required by EMS, but it's not required by ISO 14000. The ISO 14000 audit is simply to confirm compliance with their own EMS, their own policy goals. Granted, ISO 14000 requires regulatory compliance, but there are no requirements beyond that. The company can set its own policy. In EMS, companies need to be much more careful about what that policy is, because they have to report data with environmental statements on that to the public. So the issues become a little bit more complicated in EMS, and I don't think it can be disputed that it's the stronger system. Now, with all environmental management systems, and this is something that you may be involved in if you work with a company that's large enough to have its environmental management system in place, you'll quickly learn that environmental management systems are very effective in some companies and not very effective in others, primarily because of senior management commitment and employee education and training. A lot of the reviews of environmental management systems have found these two factors to be among the most important as an explanation for how an EMS is really influential within an organization and when it's not. And all personnel being trained is a requirement of an audit for an EMS, but the degree to which that is realized will depend a lot upon senior management commitment. And then you can have pro forma training, and then you can have fully integrated training for all staff up and down the line across various departments, whether that be administration, production, waste management, whatever the case may be. And you can quickly tell when you go within an organization, a business organization, how seriously they're taking their environmental management system. It's very easy to tell quite early on in the process. And because EMS requires companies to report their environmental performance, including emissions, to the general public, it's easier for companies, or EMS gets more fully integrated into companies and more seriously taken into consideration by companies because of those public reporting requirements. Whereas ISO 14000 tends to be even more dependent upon a strong management commitment and a strong economic rationale, marketplace rationale for adopting ISO 14000. These are simply the realities of one being more stringent than the other, both being useful, but one being more stringent than the other. And that's primarily tied to the public reporting requirements. Can you imagine now if all Canadian companies were required to that wanted an EMS were required to publicly report their emissions? Can you imagine the significance of that relative to what we have now in ISO 14000? It's obviously a very, very substantial distinction. And whereas some might want to downplay that distinction, I think you know enough from your training in Environmental Policy 1 and now Environmental Policy 2 that public reporting functions are particularly important to motivate action because they impact markets, they impact government regulatory decisions. And if you're forced to report publicly, you're going to be minding your P's and Q's much more carefully. Now that said, ISO 14000 has still achieved some substantial goals because it has raised awareness of environmental issues within business organizations throughout most or many business organizations in North America. Now, many people would argue that it hasn't gone far enough, and I would tend to agree with them on that. But that does not mean that what has been accomplished is unimportant. It's still an important achievement. So read your material environmental management systems. Many of you, once you get jobs in organizations, if you're not, well, even if you are in a laboratory setting, actually, you will be involved in implementing the environmental management system of your organization, without doubt. And so getting a good handle on that EMS, how it's managed within the company, whether it's strongly integrated, not strongly integrated, what are the motivators, how strong is the leadership support for the EMS, and so on, all become important factors in understanding the context for your job. If an EMS is fully integrated into an organization, it's a big deal. Selling environmental arguments to senior management, whether it be in operations or wherever, becomes a lot easier for the advocate for the environment within an organization, which is what essentially all environmental people, environmental staff in an organization are, advocates for the environment. It's becomes much easier when your system is fully integrated into the company. When it's a marginal add-on, which can happen in a lot of companies, it still becomes much more difficult because the EMS becomes a way of people saying, well, we already did that, and it was a pain, and we don't want to do much more, and it becomes much more difficult for the environmental advocate within an organization to sell environmental improvements. So the importance of the EMS cannot be understated in terms of the dynamics it creates within a company. Okay? So on that score, I'm going to let you go, and we'll be back to you again for the next week. Cheers. Bye-bye now.